Welcome to Gevercom, where the wise get wiser. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And we're going to, of course, look at a few important key words that begin with this letter. A few of them are found in really key passages as well that we're going to read. So one, life, which is found in that phrase, the tree of life, we're going to read from Proverbs 3. We're also going to look at a verse from Proverbs 31, that very famous Proverbs 31 noble woman passage. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means and just read that together. And we're going to conclude with perhaps one of the most important verses in the Bible from Exodus 34, which talks about the very character and nature of God and what his name really means, who he is, what are his ways. And so that's going to be really helpful for us to understand the rest of the Bible. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. Well, we are now going to get started with our 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And we're going to be looking at this letter that's called the Chet letter. But before we get there, I do want to take a moment just to review our Hebrew alphabet in full and even do it just a little bit slower together. So hopefully, again, by this point, it's starting to feel a little bit more familiar. If it still feels a little bit weird and unfamiliar and foggy, that's okay. It's perfectly normal. It's often called the fog, as so many have affectionately referred to it as. And to some extent, unfortunately, the fog kind of just keeps rolling with you as you go, meaning that as you learn new things of the new language of Hebrew, it will still feel unfamiliar as you learn it. But when you look back, say lessons before, even months before eventually, it won't feel quite as weird or strange anymore. And that's because you've moved past where that fog was. So just stick with it and keep practicing. And I do promise that it will become more familiar with time. All right, well, let's practice our Hebrew alphabet. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. So let's do it a little more slowly together. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, He, Tzale, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, and Tav. All right, so let's do it a little bit quicker together. So if you need, or perhaps if you want, pause it here and try to do this on your own without me. All right, well, let's go together here. We have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samik, Ayin, Pe, Sade, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right, well, that's our Hebrew alphabet. So let's go ahead and get into our letter for today. So the letter for today is the Chet, the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So we're going to talk a little bit about the form, how you write it and what it looks like. So at this point, as we've normally done, I encourage you to take out a piece of paper and a pen and just practice. Write this out a few times and take note of some of the key features that we mention here. Well, to begin with, you are going to start by drawing a horizontal line kind of near the top or at the top of our space here, right? So just a horizontal line at the top. Then you can draw a vertical line from the top piece down to the bottom. And then, of course, you draw another piece here on the left side. And you end up having what maybe looks sort of like a table, if you will. Now, another way that you can draw this is to just simply make it one simple stroke if you want, where you could just go up, over, and down, or up, over, and down. Typically, though, it's written like this, in this order. And as we'll see, there are some different letters that can easily be mistaken with this one. So there are a few features that you want to be careful about. One is that this is sort of a three-sided box, right? So it's not closed in on the bottom. Second, it is closed here, and we'll talk about this also in a second with another similar letter. And also, it's nice and square here at the bottom, which again we'll talk about when we get to the letter Tav. Okay, so again, practice that and kind of get a feel for what it feels like, what it looks like. And one of those ways to kind of get a feel also is just looking at some different fonts, some different ways that it's written, especially nowadays with computers and such. So this is the more biblical Hebrew style or format. So you can see this. It has that kind of nice square form here, and then sort of this leg, the secondary leg that comes off, and it's connected. But as you can see here with these other fonts, what's a bit more core to it is just this three-sided kind of box aspect to it. So with this one, you have a bit more of a fancy, prominent type top here. But in these other fonts, it's not quite as pronounced. It's much more simplified. In this one, instead of that piece going out, it actually kind of goes up. So this one, you probably would write it like something like that. So that's another way to write it. This one's kind of almost a little bit silly looking, but it's kind of a very tall and skinny, angular type. So there's a few different ways. What's most important, though, is just that it's a nice square, three-sided table type letter. Okay? All right. So we can talk a little bit about the development in some of the previous early forms of this letter as well. So as we see here, this is the proto-Sinaitic form that was used from about the time of the Judges to perhaps Abraham. And there's a few different ways that this is sometimes written, either like this or more horizontally, but generally they kind of look similar. And actually, as you see here with our Paleo-Hebrew form, again, it looks almost kind of the same as the Proto-Sinaitic. It really didn't change too much. And this would have been popular or used during the time of the kings, the monarchy period of Israel. So a couple other things to consider here is the sound. So the sound of this one is perhaps the most Hebrew letter of the whole alphabet. And this is the letter that most people probably associate with Hebrew. And that's because it has that very guttural, throaty sound to it, where it's that So it's sometimes indicated with the CH, which is typically what I'm going to indicate it with, CH sound. Sometimes an H or an H with a dot, or even the KH sound. But it's really just kind of a unique sound in Hebrew that we really don't have exactly in English. And I like to say, as you're practicing this letter, if you didn't spit a little bit on your screen, then you probably didn't say it right. So you got to really kind of dig deep into the back of your throat to say this letter, that sound. And don't feel bad if you're not getting that sound exactly right in the beginning here. It'll take a little bit of practice. Also, we can mention here that the letter Chet is the letter or the number 8. And so, for instance, in say Genesis 8, it would be Bereshit Chet in terms of how it's annotated here. So the number 8. We can also mention a couple or a similar letter, one that we've learned so far at least. And as I mentioned, we'll learn another one at the end of the alphabet. But between these two, we have our Chet and our He. So our He, which is our H sound, and then our Chet, which is the Ch sound. And as you can see, they're almost exactly the same, except for this tiny little gap here. And so, as you can see, this is a very, very, very important little gap. And unfortunately, in some fonts, especially if you actually open up a Dead Sea Scrolls book or whatever, pull it up online, oftentimes there's not much gap there at all. And so sometimes it is difficult to know for sure which one it is. And the only thing that can be helpful at times is that you just know the word and the proper spelling. But at least in our modern Hebrew Bible forms, it will always be pretty easily identified like this. All right, well, let's go ahead and talk about some key words with this Chet letter at the beginning. Well, the first one we want to start with here is our word for life. So we see here on the right-hand side, we have the word chaya. Chaya. And chaya is a verb meaning he lived. He lived. And then we have the word chaim. Chaim. And this is just a word like a noun meaning life. So you may have heard the Jewish phrase that they'll say l'chaim, and it literally means to life or for life, but it's kind of just a saying, a blessing of sorts. And as we'll see in a little bit here with our verses, of course, this is the word used with the tree of life as well, chaim. All right. So another couple words here to compare is the word chaya, as we see here on the right, chaya, versus chaya, chaya. And you'll notice this one has the chet, right? It's closed. And this one has the he, it's open. And maybe you could kind of think about the chet versus the he as though you were like, this sound is like a closed sound, right? Whereas the he is sort of an open, as though you're opening your mouth or your throat. Right? Maybe that helps you remember. But as you can see, chaya or chaya means he lived, right? Related to life. Whereas chaya is just the to be verb, meaning he was or it was. And so chaya is extremely common, just as you would imagine it might be, just as is or was is very common in English. Chaya is a very important word, but it's not as common, of course, as chaya, though still pretty common. Okay, so this brings us to our next word that is very, very, very important. And this is the word chesed. 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 And chesed is a little bit difficult to translate because it it gets translated in a number of ways, I should say. Sometimes as steadfast love, sometimes just as faithfulness. I think it's probably a little bit better to say something like covenantal love or covenantal faithfulness. And that's because there is a word for just love and there is a word for just faithful. And so chesed is something a little bit different. And I would say maybe, kind of bringing both of them together, but also is typically found in a covenantal sense or context. So it perhaps had a wider range of use, but at least in the Bible, it often gets used in a bit more of a covenantal connotation. And we'll, of course, encounter this word in one of our key verses. Now, another one that's very interesting is this word chayil. 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 Now, chayil is interesting because it's a word that oftentimes means something like mighty or even like army or soldier. So it can be used in the sense of like physical strength and power. But that's not the only way it's used. Many other times it's used of, say, Boaz, for instance, who was old, right? He was an older man, but he was high social status and he was very wealthy. So it seems to at least include the idea of being powerful or mighty in the sense of social or economic status. But we also find that Ruth, in the story of Boaz and Ruth, is also called a chayil. And so, she's not powerful. She's not mighty physically. She's a young lady. She certainly wasn't of high social status. She was a widow. She was an immigrant, outsider, and she was poor, right? She was very vulnerable. So it doesn't really fit to say that she was mighty in a kind of soldier sense. So what was the book of Ruth trying to say? Well, I think it means that she was mighty in virtue and character, which I think overlaps with Boaz as well. If you recall in the story, it was a very precarious situation that Ruth found herself in, as well as Boaz. But because both of them were virtuous, honorable, noble, high character kind of people who feared the Lord, even though they were almost caught up in a scandal of sorts, they both came out very noble, right? And dealt with it in the light, so to speak. And so we find that both David is called a chayil, probably in the sense of all of the terms, right? David was mighty physically. Socially, he was a king, right? Economically, he was a king. And also he was virtuous. He had a great sense of character as well. And there's an overlap with that Proverbs 31 woman that we'll read here in just a little bit. So a very interesting and very, important and vital word that helps us to understand the kinds of people that are in the lineage of David, but are also those kinds of people who are faithful to the Lord. And so there is a kind of overlap between the chayil and those who are faithful to the Lord. All right, well, let's look at a couple more words that are very important, favorite words of my own here. And we see here on our right-hand side the word hakam, chakam, and then we see on the left-hand side here, chokmah. Now, this might seem a little bit weird, but this is actually the O sound. So that might be a little bit odd or seem a little bit strange. But this is kind of just one of those unique vowel situations. They're not super common, but they do occur. So you kind of just have to learn which words have that sound and which ones are a regular A sound. So this is one of those that has the O sound. So we pronounce it chokmah. So on the right here, hakam is the verb, meaning he was. And then on the left-hand side, we have chokmah, which is the noun for wisdom. And we could actually also throw in here one other one from gever hakam. And gever hakam is very similar to this first hakam, except that it has two of the kamats instead of a kamats and patak. And so hakam with a patak is a verb, meaning he was wise, but as in gever hakam, it is used as an adjective, meaning a wise person, a wise man. And so those are three really important and key words, especially in the book of Proverbs, in Deuteronomy, in this book of Psalms especially. All right, well, we can actually learn one of our numbers here. So as we see, we have the word chamesh and chamisha. Chamesh, chamisha. Chamesh, chamisha. So chamesh and chamisha both mean 5. And so one is masculine form and one is feminine form. And we'll talk a little bit more about masculine and feminine stuff once we get into our more formal grammar study. All right, another interesting pair of words that we should compare or contrast, I should say, is the two words halal, halal, and the word halal, halal. Now, when we looked at the letter he, we actually did take a look at this word, halal, right? It was with the word hallelujah, right? Worship the Lord. But halal is not the same word. As you notice here, this is with the chet, the chet. And so the difference is actually quite important. They're almost like exactly opposite of words. Halal, of course, means to praise. He praised. But halal, with the chet, means to profane or to slay, or in a few instances, maybe something like to begin, though begin and profane sometimes are overlapping in a sense. So, of course, it's very important to recognize which letter that you're looking at here, because that would, or very well could, drastically change your interpretation of the verse. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started with our verse here. So we're going to be looking at Proverbs 3, verses 18. And this is, of course, a very interesting and beautiful little poem that is found in chapter 3 of Proverbs. And it's really talking about this woman wisdom, right? Blessed is the one who finds or holds to this woman wisdom. And so woman wisdom is actually compared with this tree of life, as we see. So let's read it together here. So we have etz, chaim, etz, chaim, he. Etz, chaim, he. So what does that mean? Well, etz is the word for tree. Chaim means life. Good. And he is actually one of our pronouns that means she. So that might sound a little bit funny, but he is she. He is she. All right. So this is saying she is a tree of life. She is a tree of life. All right, so let's go on in the verse here. So the next part we have here is La machazikim ba. La machazikim ba. La machazikim ba. All right, and this one's a little bit trickier. There's a lot going on here. But we can notice at least a couple things that we've perhaps seen elsewhere. Here we have this la, which means to or for. And then we also have ba, which is that b, meaning in, with, by, among. And then also a added to the end here, something that you should hang on to, and we'll see very often, is actually the pronoun meaning her. So meaning like for those chazak, holding on to or grasping onto her, right? So she, wisdom, is a tree of life for those grasping onto her. For those grasping onto her. All right, let's continue on here. So we have ve to me ke ha me u shar. Ve to me ke ha me u shar. Ve to me ke ha me u shar. So, as we see here, that very common word we've learned already, the meaning and. So and tamak means to like very similar in the sense of to hold on to or to grasp. So and those holding on to or grasping ha. So here again her. And then me ushar. And this is related to the word ashrei, which is like the word meaning to be blessed or blessed are, right? The kind of a similar word we find from Psalm 1. And so we see that this is meant to be compared with the very first word of this verse, right? So a tree of life is she, right? She is a tree of life for those holding or grasping onto her. You might think of it like somebody who's, hanging onto the side of a boat about to fall off into the treacherous waters or something, or hanging onto the side of a building so they don't fall off and, fall to the ground and be hurt or killed. So those who hold on to her are those who are blessed. And even this word blessed, it actually comes from the word meaning to advance or to move forward or to progress. And so we don't often maybe think about being blessed as somebody who advances, but I think biblically it makes sense. Blessed are those who advance or move forward. But what are you moving forward to, or what are you advancing towards? That's an important question. Well, I would say it's those who are moving towards God, those who are moving, advancing, progressing in the ways of God, becoming more like Him, emulating Him, right? Loving people and the world and treating people the way He does Himself. And that ultimately leads to a greater knowledge of God. And so to say one is blessed, ashrei, I think does actually carry the sense of one who advances ultimately towards God. And so, of course, the tree of life is a really important and interesting phrase because it only occurs a couple times in the whole Bible. We know it from Genesis 3, right? Genesis 2 and 3. And we know that it also occurs at the very end of the Bible in Revelation 22. But this is one of the other few times that it actually occurs in the Bible. You might think it would occur a bunch of times, but this is one of the only other times it actually does occur. And so I think what Proverbs is trying to say is that the way to undo, or we might say reverse, the fall, right, to a kind of Garden Eden type of relationship with the Lord is by becoming wise, which really elevates the sense of what it means to be wise, right? Being wise doesn't mean just getting more stuff in this life. It doesn't mean being just more successful in this life either. It means doing and being and knowing God, right? Being like God and knowing Him and walking in His ways, which the book of Proverbs correlates with the Torah, right? Walking in the instructions of the Lord. So the tree of life and wisdom and being blessed are all very intricately related together. And that's why we see it at the beginning of the Bible and at the end of the Bible. And of course, why we see it here in Proverbs. All right, well, let's go ahead and jump to our next very interesting verse. We've got some really good ones in this lesson. So this one is, of course, that very, very famous passage called the Proverbs 31 woman. And so let's read it together here. So we have Eshet Chayil Mi Yimtza. Eshet Chayil Mi Yimtza. Chet, Chayil, Mi, Yimtza. All right. So what do we have here? Well, Eshet is that word for Isha. So the vowels, and it's kind of changed a little bit, which is one of those things that makes Hebrew a little bit challenging at times. But this is the word Isha, meaning a wife or a woman, right? So a wife or a woman, and then Chayil. And so Chayil is that word that we mentioned already from earlier. It means mighty or powerful or great, but probably here in the sense of virtue and character. So sometimes you'll see it translated as excellent woman or even excellent wife or a noble woman or a virtuous woman. I think that it's probably legitimate to say too that this Proverbs 31 woman, this Chayil woman, really is meant to connect with and coordinate with woman wisdom from the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs. And the book of Proverbs with the woman wisdom is really kind of like this exalted figure in many ways, which even the New Testament seems to coordinate and connect with Jesus, the Son, the Christ. Many overlapping types of characteristics and roles. All right, so this mighty, virtuous woman, it says, me, which is who, the question who, yimtza. So who will find, or who perhaps can or may find. So this little yod on the front of this word, matzah means to find. And so yimtza can mean something like either he will find, or he may find, or perhaps he could find. It's kind of a little bit open in that sense for us as English speakers. So we might say like, who can find a virtuous woman? All right. And then the next part of this, we have ve rachok mi peninim mikra. Ve rachok mi peninim mikra. So what do we have here? Well, we have, of course, our very famous common word here, the, and then rakok means actually like more than or far, remote. So here it's maybe best translated something like rare, since it means like far away or remote. So, and remote or far away, and then that word we've seen before, me, attached to the front, means, oftentimes it means from, but as we've already seen in many of our verses, it can mean something like more than. So in this case, obviously, it's something like more than. So, and remote, more than penanim, which is something like jewels or pearls or some kind of a precious item. And then mikra. Now, this one's a little bit tricky because you see that mem on the front. So you might be tricked into thinking it's this from word. But in this case, it's not. It is actually a part of the root word, makar. And that means to be precious. And so this end here with the lets us know it's the pronoun meaning her. So her preciousness or her value, right? So her value is more rare than jewels, or more precious, or more costly, or more remote, right? More unsearchable than the jewels, right? And so that's saying a lot about how valuable she is and what a great commodity or, treasure that she really is. And again, and it goes on to talk about how she's very industrious and other things, that she takes care of her family and her community. She's not a difficult person. She's very helpful and charitable. But probably the most important thing is, again, like we said, she's probably meant to coordinate with woman wisdom, who is associated with godliness, fear of the Lord, right? Upright and righteous. And so it's really also a matter of character, that she is virtuous. She is chayil. And that's really what makes her so precious, right? It's not simply that she's industrious, but it's that she has a wonderful character. So very, very important. Really the essence of wisdom. All right, well, let's go ahead and talk about, again, not last but not least, perhaps one of the most interesting and important verses in the whole Bible, because we learn about the very nature of God from his own mouth, how he describes his own self. So let's read it together here from Exodus 34. So we see here, Vaya'avor Adonai al panav. Vaya'avor Adonai al panav. All right, so let's see what we got here. So the word avar, which is the root avar, which means to pass over or to cross. And so we see that v and as we mentioned just shortly ago, that yod is what is normally used in the sense of he. So, and he passed. And so who's passing? The Lord. And so the Lord passed all. And all is the word meaning like on or above. And then we have panav. And pan or pane or panim is the word for face. Face. And then the v at the end is our pronoun him. So something like the Lord passed over his face. Now, in good English, we would just say passed before him. And that's perfectly fine. And sometimes you can go into these words and actually pull out some maybe more important subtle nuances from the words. But sometimes words like panim are just kind of idiomatic in the sense that they're used as like the word before. And so it may not necessarily mean anything special, okay? Because panim is just extremely, extremely common word throughout the Bible. So here it's really just trying to express that the Lord passed before him, meaning Moses. And again, this is, after Israel had done the golden calf incident. Basically, the Lord said he was going to cut off Israel and, get rid of them and start a new nation out of just Moses. And Moses, as the great leader that he is or that he was, he pleads with the Lord and says, don't do that. Please spare the people. Help me, lead us, forgive us, spare us, right? Basically saying, if you're going to kill them, kill me too. And so after that, the Lord basically agrees. And with that, he declares to Moses his very nature and his very character, which is wrapped up in his name and his characteristics, his qualities. So let's read the rest of this together. So we see in the next part, Va Yikra Adonai El. Va Yikra Adonai El. Va Yikra or Va Yikra Adonai El. All right, so what do these words mean? Well, hara is the root word meaning to say or to call out. And then, of course, we see that va word and as you hopefully will start noticing, that yod is very common in Hebrew, especially in narrative and story. So, and he called. So the Lord called out. So, and the Lord called out, Adonai El. Now, Adonai El is probably meaning either the Lord God, or maybe that the Lord is God, or perhaps the Lord God is. So there's a few different ways that you might be able to take this phrase, and it's kind of open to a little bit of interpretation on exactly how you term this, but I think the basic idea is the same either way. So let's go on to the next part of this verse, which says, and so again, this is describing who the Adonai El is, right? From his own very mouth, the Lord said, this isn't Moses, this is the Lord saying, who am I? What am I like? And so he says, the Lord God, Rakum, Chanun, Erek, Apayim. Rachum, Chanun, Erek, Apayim. And so what does this mean? Well, Rachum means something like merciful or compassionate. It sort of actually means like intestines or womb. And so it's kind of like the sense of like feeling it in your guts, right? So he has like a gut reaction, so mercy or compassion. And then and of course, chanun, which is the word related to grace or favor. So sometimes it's chen, or the verb chanan, he was gracious. And in here, chanun, which is sort of just another variation of the word, meaning to have or to be gracious. And then erek, which actually means long. And then apayim. And apayim actually means like nostrils. So that's kind of weird, isn't it? Long nostrils. What does that mean? Well, it's actually an interesting Hebrew idiom that means to be long of nose or long of nostrils, implying that if you have a long nose, that you are patient. And I think that's because they also will use the phrase meaning like a hot nose, chama. And so there's just kind of a play on, idiom there, I suppose, that, if you're angry, you have a hot nose. And if you're patient, then you have a long nose. And so that's kind of a fun, interesting little idiom. And so maybe you could use that around your house or with your friends. Instead of calling them, your friend so patient, you can call them long of nose. It's like, oh, you, my friend, are so long of nose. You might have to explain that compliment to them, but we'll see how it goes over with them. All right. Well, so this is again describing the Lord. He is merciful and he is gracious, meaning he is giving, right? He is abundant in favor. He is patient, right? He's not quick to anger or to be rash. And then we find, of course, one of our key words here. Ve'rav chesed ve'emet. Ve'rav chesed ve'emet. Ve'rav chesed ve'emet. So what do we have here? Well, we have that, again, very famous word, and, plus rav, which rav is meaning full, really not even full. It means more like abounding or much, a lot of something, but full of just kind of sounds nicer in English. And then, of course, that word we looked at earlier, chesed. And again, like I said, it's maybe something like covenant love or covenant faithfulness or steadfast love. It's kind of hard to say exactly what it is because, as we see in the very next word or phrase here, the and emet, which means faithful or true. So he is full of or abounding in chesed and emet. Very, very key ideas about who God is. In other words, what it's really trying to communicate is that he's faithful to what he said. Now, we won't read the second part of this passage, verse 7, but he does go on to say that he is also just, right? And that's a part of even his covenant love and faithfulness, right? God is not just love in the kind of, movie Hallmark kind of sense. He's not just a big squishy teddy bear. He is covenantally faithful, right? He is gracious and merciful. He is patient, but at the same time, he is also just. He is good. And sometimes being good means disciplining, right? Even a son, even someone that you love. But definitely it also means judging and being just, especially when evil has been done, right? Because if you think about justice, only in terms of the person who is being judged, right, who did the evil thing, well, you might think it's merciful to let them off the hook, but what about the person that they wronged, right? Is that just? No, it's not. And it's not loving and merciful either to that person, right? And so it's a fine line to walk, but God is perfect, right? And he is perfectly good and he's all powerful. He's perfectly gracious and merciful and patient, and he's perfectly true and faithful and full of covenant, steadfast love. And of course, like we mentioned in verse 7, he's also perfectly just. So a very interesting and powerful verse, one that we see echoing throughout the rest of scriptures, and one that is important for us to remember as we read different passages in the scriptures that maybe sometimes will seem a little bit odd or make us question what's really going on here, or how could God do something like that? And again, we can look back to the very nature of God as he describes himself, right? Even though he could have been perfectly just in cutting off Israel at that very moment when they defied him and worshiped another idol, a god of different type. But he was gracious and merciful. But he did also give consequences for their actions. And eventually, as we find out in Numbers, his patience does run out eventually, unfortunately for them. So a good reminder for us to look to God, but also not to take for granted or take advantage of, I should say, his grace and his mercy. He will stay true to his promises, but as a true and good father, he promised that he would discipline those whom he loves, right? So let's try to serve him and worship him with all integrity. All right, well, let's go ahead and finish up here with our alphabet one more time. So let's go through it together. So we have here Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pe, Sadek, Kof, Resh, Sin, Shin, Tav. All right. Well, that wraps us up for our 8th letter, the letter Chet. And I hope you learned something. I hope you'll be one of the Chayil. And I look forward to seeing you next time.